They say some places never truly die, but linger, breathing forgotten histories and unspeakable terrors into the present. In the heart of Philadelphia, an imposing fortress of stone casts a long, suffocating shadow over the surrounding streets. This is Eastern State Penitentiary, a sprawling Gothic monolith designed not merely to hold criminals, but to completely dismantle the human mind. Behind its massive, crumbling walls lies a dark legacy of suffering so profound that many believe it permanently fractured the barrier between the living and the dead. The 1829 opening of this revolutionary institution was heralded as a triumph of modern justice. Founded on Quaker principles, the penitentiary was built to replace physical punishment with spiritual reflection. The architects believed that absolute solitary confinement would force inmates to look inward, find God, and experience true penitence. Yet this noble theory birthed a monstrous reality. The separate system, as it was called, became the root cause of an unimaginable psychological torment, transforming a house of reform into an incubator for sheer madness. To enforce this absolute isolation, the architecture itself was weaponized. Massive stone corridors radiated from a central surveillance hub like the spokes of a wheel, ensuring that every movement could be monitored. The cells were designed like concrete tombs, equipped with a single, tiny skylight known as the Eye of God. Inmates lived in perpetual twilight, walled off from the world, the sky, and the sound of another human voice. The physical structure was a masterclass in sensory deprivation, built to crush the spirit. When a prisoner arrived at Eastern State, a black hood was immediately placed over their head. They were led blindly through the echoing halls, stripped of their identity, and thrust into a silent void. For years they would see no one, not even the guards who fed them through a small slot in the heavy wooden doors. The suffocating quiet was meant to provoke divine revelation, but instead it bred a desperate, clawing despair. Men wept, paced endlessly, and slowly lost their grip on reality. It is from this wellspring of extreme psychological agony that the penitentiary's chilling paranormal reputation arises. According to legend, the intense energy of thousands of minds breaking in the dark never dissipated. Visitors and former staff have reported witnessing fleeting shadow figures darting along the catwalks, their forms dissolving into the damp stone. These alleged apparitions move with a frantic, disjointed energy, mirroring the frantic pacing of men driven utterly insane by the relentless silence. When the silence failed to produce compliant penitence, the guards resorted to horrific physical punishments to maintain control. Historical records detail barbaric disciplinary tools used to break rebellious inmates. The mad chair involved strapping a man so tightly to a wooden seat that his circulation stopped, often leaving permanent tissue damage. The water bath plunged inmates into freezing water during the bitter winter months, leaving them chained to the wall until ice formed on their skin. The most dreaded instrument of torture was the iron gag. A metal collar was clamped onto the prisoner's tongue and chained to their wrists, which were strapped tightly behind their back. Any movement, any attempt to relieve the agonizing strain on the arms, would tear the tongue and cause severe bleeding. Under such barbaric conditions, the facade of spiritual rehabilitation crumbled entirely, leaving only a raw, terrifying struggle for basic survival. The echoes of that specific cruelty seem to linger vividly in the decaying corridors. Decades after these practices were abolished, those walking the empty halls have reported hearing the unmistakable sounds of muffled weeping and agonizing gasps. Some claim to hear the heavy, dragging footsteps of men shackled in iron, echoing from empty cells. These auditory anomalies are often accompanied by a sudden, unnatural drop in temperature, as if the cold cruelty of the past is bleeding through the very mortar. As the decades passed and the population swelled, the strict adherence to solitary confinement began to fracture. The prison expanded, constructing new wings to accommodate the overflow. Block 12, a later addition, represented a shift away from the original separate system toward a more conventional, multi-tiered cell block. Yet, this modernized section housed some of the most violent offenders, eventually becoming the designated holding area for death row inmates awaiting transfer to the electric chair. Today, Block 12 is widely considered one of the most actively haunted locations within the sprawling complex. It is here that witnesses have reported hearing disembodied laughter echoing off the peeling paint, a chilling sound that defies the grim history of the space. Others allege experiencing unseen forces, describing the terrifying sensation of being grabbed, pushed, or watched by a hostile presence. The dread in Block 12 is palpable, a heavy, suffocating atmosphere that seems to press inward on the chest. The penitentiary's dark history is not only defined by the anonymous suffering of the poor, but also by the infamous figures who walked its halls. In 1929, the notorious Chicago crime boss Al Capone was sentenced to Eastern State on a concealed weapons charge. Unlike the wretched souls in the lower blocks, Capone lived in relative luxury. His cell was adorned with fine furniture, oriental rugs, a cabinet radio, and oil paintings, a stark contrast to the barren concrete tombs of his fellow inmates. Yet, despite his wealth and privilege, Capone could not escape the psychological horrors of the penitentiary. During his 8-month stay, the ruthless gangster was allegedly tormented by a spectral visitor. Guards reported hearing Capone screaming in terror in the dead of night, begging an unseen entity named Jimmy to leave him alone. Many believe this was the vengeful spirit of James Clark, one of the men brutally murdered in the St. Valentine's Day massacre under Capone's orders. The terror that gripped the untouchable crime boss serves as a chilling testament to the oppressive atmosphere of the prison. Whether Capone was suffering from the early stages of syphilis-induced madness or genuinely haunted by the ghosts of his violent past, Eastern State amplified his torment. The prison had a unique ability to strip away bravado, forcing every man to confront his deepest, darkest demons in the cold, unforgiving silence of his cell. By the mid-20th century, the Grand Quaker experiment had entirely collapsed. The separate system was officially abandoned, recognized not as a tool for salvation, but as a mechanism for psychological destruction. The penitentiary transitioned into a standard congregate prison, but it was fundamentally unsuited for this purpose. The massive stone walls, designed for isolation, now trapped thousands of angry, desperate men in overcrowded, unsanitary conditions, breeding a new era of violence, riots, and systemic despair. The accumulated trauma of this era seeped into the foundation. The air grew thick with the residue of countless shattered lives, bloody shiv fights in the exercise yards, and the quiet, desperate suicides in the dead of night. Eastern State became a warehouse for human misery, a place where hope was systematically extinguished. The psychological weight of this collective suffering transformed the physical structure, turning the damp stone and rusting iron into a monument of unyielding sorrow. This enduring sorrow is often cited by those who maintain the property today. In the early 1990s, a locksmith named Gary Johnson was working to restore a 140-year-old lock in cell block 4. He reported a sudden, overwhelming feeling of dread washing over him, followed by an unseen force gripping him so tightly he could not move. When the paralyzing grip finally released, he claimed to see a collection of agonizing faces manifesting on the cell wall, silently screaming into the void. The penitentiary finally closed its heavy iron gates in 1971, deemed too antiquated and crumbling to house modern prisoners. The inmates were transferred, the guards walked away, and the massive fortress was simply abandoned to the elements. For 2 decades, Eastern State sat empty, a decaying relic in the middle of a bustling modern city. A forest of feral cats and overgrown vegetation reclaimed the exercise yards, while the elements slowly ate away at the vaulted ceilings and plaster walls. In this state of ruin, the true, terrifying beauty of the penitentiary emerged. The skylights, once intended to be the eye of God, shattered, allowing rain, snow, and relentless rot to pour into the cells. The paint peeled away in large, dry flakes, revealing layers of history beneath. The iron bed frames rusted into jagged skeletal shapes. The prison became a haunting landscape of decay, a visual representation of the broken minds it had once housed. It was during this period of abandonment that the legends of the haunting truly took root in the public consciousness. Urban explorers who braved the crumbling walls reported a profound sense of being watched from the empty guard towers. They spoke of strange, shifting shadows in the subterranean corridors and the distinct feeling of walking through cold spots that defied the summer heat. The silence of the ruins was not peaceful. It was expectant, heavy with the unseen presence of the past. Historians and researchers suggest that the extreme emotional output of Eastern State's inmates created what is known as a residual haunting. This theory posits that intense trauma, fear, and madness can imprint upon the physical environment, much like a recording on magnetic tape. The limestone walls and iron bars of the penitentiary, having absorbed over a century of profound human suffering, continually replay these tragic echoes, trapping the spectral remnants of the prisoners in an endless loop of despair. Nowhere is this psychic imprint more intensely felt than in the subterranean punishment cells, colloquially known as the hole. Carved into the foundation beneath the main blocks, these windowless, unventilated dungeons were used for the most severe infractions. Inmates were thrown into absolute pitch-black darkness for weeks at a time, given only a bucket and a meager ration of bread and water. The sensory deprivation here was absolute, designed to break even the most hardened will. Those who stand near the entrance to the hole today often report an overwhelming, irrational urge to flee. Visitors allege feeling a heavy, oppressive energy rising from the dark stairwell, accompanied by the distinct smell of damp earth and unwashed bodies. Some claim to hear faint, rhythmic tapping emanating from the depths, a desperate, coded communication from souls long forgotten in the crushing blackness. The sheer concentration of misery in this small space is reportedly palpable to anyone who approaches. The tragedy of Eastern State Penitentiary is magnified by the tragic irony of its founding. It was conceived by reformers who genuinely believed they were building a machine for salvation, a place where men could be redeemed through quiet contemplation. Instead, they engineered one of the most efficient psychological torture chambers in human history. The realization that such profound cruelty was inflicted under the guise of religious benevolence adds a sickening, melancholic layer to the atmosphere of the ruins. The dark impact of this institution extended far beyond the borders of Philadelphia. The architectural design and the philosophy of solitary confinement were copied by over 300 prisons worldwide. Eastern State became the blueprint for a global experiment in psychological isolation, spreading its specific brand of despair across continents. One must wonder if the echoes of madness that haunt these original walls have reverberated through history, leaving a trail of unseen spiritual wreckage in their wake. Today, the crumbling facade of Eastern State Penitentiary stands as a grim monument to the catastrophic failure of forced isolation. The physical structure is slowly surrendering to time, but the dark legacy of the separate system remains firmly entrenched in the stone. It is a place where the barrier between history and nightmare is terrifyingly thin, a silent, watchful fortress where the echoes of human pain refuse to fade, continuing to haunt the minds of all who dare to enter.